They called them perfect warriors. Vikings, savage axe-wielding giants, dominated Europe for 300 years, but on the other side of the world, samurai were crafting something entirely different. A killing art so precise one cut could slice through bone and armor. Now imagine these two forces colliding. A Viking berserker charges with brute fury, only to meet a motionless samurai whose katana slices not with force, but with physics. This wasn't a clash of strength. It was an execution waiting to happen. And today we're finally answering the impossible question. Could Japanese swordsmanship have shattered Viking shields and rewritten the history of warfare? The year is 1000 Anno Domini, AD. In the fjords of Norway, Viking longships prepare for another season of raids. These warriors have perfected a brutal, effective system. Round shields made of lime wood, reinforced with iron, designed to work in shield walls where dozens of men lock their defenses together. Their weapons, axes, swords, and spears, are built for hacking, chopping, and crushing. Viking combat is about overwhelming force, psychological terror, and the raw physics of impact. Meanwhile, in feudal Japan, samurai are developing something entirely different. Their warfare isn't about raids or quick strikes. It's about perfection. Every aspect of their combat system, from the forging of their blades to the precise angles of their cuts, is designed around a single principle: absolute efficiency in ending a fight. The Viking shield, impressive as it appears, has a fatal flaw that no European enemy had ever exploited. Its circular design and the way Vikings wielded it made perfect sense against the chopping motions of axes and the thrusting attacks of spears. But it was completely unprepared for the diagonal flowing cuts that formed the foundation of Japanese swordsmanship. This isn't just speculation, it's about understanding two fundamentally different approaches to the science of killing. The science of the katana. The first thing you need to understand about a katana is that calling it a sword is like calling a Formula One car a vehicle. Every aspect of its design was engineered for a single purpose: cutting through anything that stood in its way. Japanese swordsmiths developed a technique called tamahagan, a process where iron-bearing sand was smelted in a clay furnace for 72 hours straight. The smith would literally sleep beside the furnace, monitoring the temperature by the color of the flames. From this process came steel so pure and hard that it could hold an edge sharper than a modern razor blade. But here's where it gets truly sophisticated. A katana wasn't made from one type of steel. The spine was made from soft, flexible steel that could absorb impact without breaking. The cutting edge was made from the hardest steel possible, folded and refolded hundreds of times to eliminate impurities. This created a blade that was simultaneously flexible and devastating. It could bend without breaking but cut through armor like butter. The geometry of the blade itself was a masterpiece of physics. The slight curve, called sori, wasn't just aesthetic. It concentrated the force of each cut into a smaller area, dramatically increasing the pressure per square inch. When a samurai made a diagonal cut, the curved blade would actually draw itself through the target, using the motion to increase the cutting efficiency. Compare this to a Viking sword: straight, broad, designed for chopping motions. Effective, yes, but crude by comparison. A Viking sword was a club with edges. A katana was a precision instrument of death. The difference becomes even more stark when you consider the testing methods. Vikings might test their blades by chopping wood or striking metal. Samurai had a practice called tameshigiri, cutting through actual human corpses to test the blade's performance. They kept detailed records. This katana could cut through two bodies stacked on top of each other. This one could sever a torso in a single diagonal strike. When samurai talked about their swords, they used terms like lives taken to measure a blade's quality. This wasn't just about sharpness, it was about understanding exactly how their weapon interacted with flesh, bone, and armor. fatal flaw of Viking shield design. The Viking round shield seems formidable, a meter across made of lime wood planks reinforced with iron bands, with a metal boss in the center that could be used offensively. Against the weapons they faced in Europe, it was nearly perfect. But its design contained a critical vulnerability that no European enemy had ever exploited. Viking shields were designed for linear warfare. The shield wall, where warriors stood shoulder to shoulder with overlapping shields, was their primary defensive formation. Individual combat techniques focused on using the shield to block overhead chops from axes or straight thrusts from spears. The circular design distributed force evenly, and the wooden construction absorbed the impact of crushing blows. But samurai didn't fight like Europeans. Their cutting techniques followed diagonal lines that would strike the shield at angles it was never designed to handle. Consider the most basic samurai cut, kiryotoshi, a diagonal slice from upper right to lower left. This cut wouldn't hit the strongest part of the shield, the center boss or the reinforced edges. Instead, it would strike along the wood grain at an angle that would split the planks apart like an axe splitting firewood. The physics are brutal. When you strike wood along its grain at a diagonal angle, you're not asking the wood to absorb impact. You're asking it to resist being torn apart. Wood is incredibly strong when force is applied perpendicular to the grain, but vulnerable when struck parallel to it. A samurai's diagonal cuts would find this weakness every time. There's archaeological evidence that supports this theory. Dents, cracks radiating from central points, crushed areas where axes had struck. But they show no signs of the kind of diagonal splitting that would result from Japanese cutting techniques, because no European weapon was designed to exploit this weakness. Even more damning, Viking combat manuals and saga descriptions focus almost entirely on overhead strikes, shield-to-shield pushing, and linear attacks. There's virtually no mention of defending against diagonal cuts, because such attacks simply didn't exist in European warfare. The samurai had unknowingly evolved the perfect counter to Viking defensive tactics, and the Vikings had no idea such a counter even existed. The way of precision versus the way of fury. To understand why samurai swordsmanship would have shattered Viking defenses, you need to understand that these weren't just different fighting styles. They were completely different philosophies of war. Viking combat was about rage channeled into effectiveness. The berserker, foaming at the mouth and feeling no pain, pinnacle of their warrior ideal. They fought in groups, relied on psychological intimidation, and used overwhelming force to break enemy morale. A Viking warrior was trained to hack through defenses, to keep swinging until everything in front of him was dead or fleeing. Samurai warfare was about precision elevated to an art form. A samurai spent years learning to draw his sword and cut in a single motion, yaijutsu. They practiced cutting techniques on targets made of rolled straw mats, learning to slice cleanly through precise points that would disable or kill an opponent instantly. Where Vikings sought to overwhelm, samurai sought to end fights before they truly began. The difference shows up in their training methods. Viking warriors trained by fighting each other with real weapons, accepting that injuries and deaths were part of becoming battle-ready. They built strength, endurance, and pain tolerance. A Viking warrior was tough, brutal, and experienced in taking damage while continuing to fight. Samurai training was about eliminating variables. They practiced the same cuts thousands of times until they could perform them perfectly in complete darkness. They studied anatomy to understand exactly where to strike for maximum effect. They trained their breathing, their footwork, their grip pressure. Everything was systematized and refined. Consider the nuki-uchi, the samurai quick-draw technique. A properly trained samurai could draw his katana from its scabbard and make a killing cut in less than a second. The motion was so fast that by the time an opponent realized the sword was being drawn, the cut had already been completed. Now imagine a Viking warrior accustomed to the heavy swings and obvious telegraphing of axe combat, facing this kind of speed and precision. His shield techniques, designed to deflect powerful but relatively slow attacks, would be completely inadequate against cuts that came from unexpected angles at lightning speed. The psychological impact would have been devastating. Vikings were used to facing enemies who fought like they did, with obvious aggression and straightforward attacks. The samurai's calm, precise movements would have been completely alien and terrifying. The hidden weakness of wood and iron. Here's what no Viking saga ever mentioned. Their shields had a fundamental material science problem that made them vulnerable to the specific type of attacks samurai had perfected. Viking shields were made primarily of lime wood, light, flexible, and excellent at absorbing the blunt trauma of axes and maces. The iron reinforcement bands and central boss were positioned to protect against the most common attack angles in European warfare. But this construction created zones of weakness that a katana strike would exploit mercilessly. The junction between wood and metal became a stress concentration point. When a diagonal cut struck where the iron band met the wooden planks, the difference in material properties would cause the shield to fail catastrophically. The rigid iron couldn't bend with the wood, creating a weak point that would split under the concentrated force of a katana strike. Even more problematic, the adhesives and joining techniques used in Viking shield construction weren't designed for the kind of stress that diagonal cuts would create. Viking shields were assembled with hide glue and wooden pegs, adequate for holding together under straight-line impacts but vulnerable to the twisting forces that would result from angled strikes. There's actual experimental archaeology that demonstrates this weakness. Modern researchers have recreated Viking shields using authentic materials and techniques, then tested them against various weapons. While they perform excellently against period-appropriate European weapons, they show significant vulnerabilities when struck at angles that weren't common in medieval European combat. The katana's cutting geometry would have turned these vulnerabilities into fatal flaws. The curved blade striking at a diagonal angle with incredible force concentration would have found every weak point in the shield's construction. The initial cut might not completely destroy the shield, but it would create fractures and separations that would make it useless for continued defense. But the truly devastating part wasn't just that the shield would break, it was how quickly it would happen. A katana strike delivered by a trained samurai would damage the shield so rapidly that the Viking warrior wouldn't have time to adapt his tactics or switch to a secondary weapon. The speed that history never recorded. What made samurai swordsmanship truly lethal wasn't just the quality of their blades or the precision of their techniques. It was the speed at which they could deliver multiple attacks. European combat, including Viking warfare, followed a rhythm of strike, recover, strike again. Axes and straight swords required time between attacks to build up momentum for the next blow. This gave opponents time to react, reposition, and counterattack. Viking combat was often a lengthy affair of trading blows until one warrior's strength or luck gave out. Samurai cutting techniques flowed from one into the next without pause. A diagonal cut would naturally position the blade for an immediate horizontal cut, which would flow into an upward stroke, which could transition seamlessly into another diagonal attack. This wasn't just efficient, it was overwhelming. The legendary samurai Miyamoto Musashi documented fighting techniques where he would deliver 5 or 6 cuts in the time it took an opponent to recover from defending against the first one. These weren't wild swings. Each cut was precise, targeted, and designed to either kill or disable. Consider what this would mean against a Viking shield defense. The first diagonal cut would damage the shield's structural integrity. Before the Viking could assess the damage or adjust his grip, the second cut would strike from a different angle, exploiting the weakness created by the first. The third cut would find the shield completely compromised, allowing the fourth cut to reach the warrior himself. The psychological impact would have been as devastating as the physical damage. Vikings were accustomed to the steady rhythm of European combat, where there were natural pauses that allowed for tactical thinking and repositioning. Facing an attack pattern with no pauses, no recovery time, and no predictable rhythm would have been completely overwhelming. Historical accounts of samurai combat describe opponents becoming paralyzed by the speed and precision of the attacks. Warriors who were experienced and successful against conventional enemies would freeze up when faced with cutting techniques that came faster than they could process. This speed advantage wasn't just about individual techniques, it extended to the entire flow of combat. While a Viking warrior was still processing the failure of his primary defense, the samurai would have already transitioned to the killing blow, the metallurgy that changed everything. The true secret of why samurai swordsmanship would have dominated Viking defenses lies in something most people never consider: the fundamental difference in metallurgical technology between Japan and medieval Europe. Viking weapons and shields were products of relatively primitive ironworking techniques. Their metal was often inconsistent in quality, with impurities that created weak points and unpredictable failure modes. Viking smiths were skilled, but they were working with inferior raw materials and less sophisticated techniques. Japanese swordsmiths had developed metallurgical processes that wouldn't appear in Europe for centuries. The folding and refolding of steel didn't just eliminate impurities, it created a homogeneous material with consistent properties throughout the blade. This meant that every cut delivered predictable results, and the sword would maintain its edge through extended combat. But the real game changer was the differential hardening technique called heiman. By carefully controlling the cooling process, Japanese smiths created blades where the edge was incredibly hard while the spine remained flexible. This allowed the katana to hold an edge that could cut through other metals while still being resilient enough to withstand the stresses of combat. When a katana struck a Viking shield, it wasn't just superior technique meeting inferior tactics. It was advanced metallurgy meeting primitive materials science. The hardened edge of the katana could literally cut through the iron reinforcements of Viking shields, something that European weapons of the period simply couldn't do. Archaeological evidence supports this technological gap. Japanese blades from the medieval period often show wear patterns indicating they cut through metal regularly. European swords from the same period show damage patterns consistent with cutting softer materials like leather and wood, with significant damage when they encountered hard metal. The implications are staggering. Not only would samurai techniques have been more effective against Viking defenses, but their weapons were literally made of superior materials that could cut through Viking weapons and armor. A katana could potentially cut through a Viking sword, let alone a wooden shield reinforced with inferior iron. This wasn't just a difference in fighting styles. It was a fundamental technological advantage that would have made the outcome of any conflict virtually predetermined. The moment of truth. Picture the moment when these two warrior traditions would have first collided. A Viking raider, perhaps blown off course during a raid on the English coast, washes ashore on the beaches of feudal Japan. He's everything his culture has forged him to be. Massive, scarred, fearless, with a round shield painted with the symbols of his victories, and an axe that has tasted the blood of dozens of enemies. Across from him stands a samurai, smaller in stature but carrying centuries of refined killing knowledge in his stance. His katana remains sheathed, but his hand rests on the grip with the casual confidence of someone who has spent a lifetime perfecting the art of ending lives efficiently. The Viking does what Vikings do. He roars, raises his shield, and charges. In his mind, this will be like every other fight. Overwhelming aggression will break his enemy's will, and his shield will protect him long enough to land the killing blow with his axe. But as he closes the distance, something unprecedented happens. The samurai draws his sword and cuts in a single fluid motion, yaijutsu, so fast that the Viking's eyes can't track the movement. The katana strikes his shield at a diagonal angle he's never defended against, with a force concentrated into an edge sharper than anything in his experience. The shield doesn't just break, it explodes. The wooden planks split along their grain, the iron reinforcements shear away, And suddenly the Viking finds himself holding the remnants of a defense that has protected him through years of combat. Before he can process what has happened, the samurai's blade flows into a second cut, then a third, each one faster and more precise than anything in European warfare. In less than 5 seconds, the encounter is over. The Viking, who has survived raids across Europe and earned his place among legendary warriors, lies dead. His shield, his tactics, his entire approach to warfare has been rendered obsolete by techniques he never knew existed. This isn't just speculation. It's the inevitable result when advanced metallurgy meets primitive materials, when precision technique encounters crude tactics, when centuries of refined cutting methods face defenses designed for completely different attacks. The samurai cleans his blade, sheathes it, and walks away. He doesn't understand that he has just demonstrated why his culture's approach to warfare would have rewritten European military history. The truth is, history never gave us this confrontation. Vikings and samurai existed in different worlds, separated by geography and time in ways that made their meeting impossible. But understanding why samurai swordsmanship would have shattered Viking shields tells us something profound about the nature of technological and tactical evolution. The Vikings weren't inferior warriors. They were the product of their environment and their enemies. Their shields and tactics were perfectly adapted to European warfare, where they faced opponents using similar weapons and fighting styles. They dominated their world because they understood their world. But they had never encountered anything like Japanese cutting techniques, differential hardening, or the philosophical approach to combat that turned killing into a precise art form. Their defenses were designed for one type of warfare and would have been helpless against another. This raises a haunting question. How many other warrior cultures developed techniques that would have completely revolutionized warfare if they had encountered different enemies? How many tactical innovations were lost because the cultures that developed them never met the right opponents to demonstrate their effectiveness? The samurai sword techniques that would have destroyed Viking shields weren't just about superior technology. They represented a completely different way of thinking about combat. Where Vikings saw warfare as a test of strength and will, samurai saw it as a problem to be solved through precision and efficiency. In the end, the Vikings' legendary shields would have been shattered not by superior strength, but by superior understanding. The samurai had cracked the code of cutting, and once you understand the science of the blade, no defense designed for cruder weapons can stand against it. What other lost confrontations might have changed the course of history? What innovations died with their creators because they never faced the right challenge? The story of samurai versus Viking isn't just about two warrior cultures. It's about the paths not taken and the knowledge that history forgot to preserve. What warrior culture do you think would have dominated if they had met the samurai in their prime? Share your thoughts below, and let's explore another impossible battle that history never gave us.